Hello, everybody. I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm the curator of maps and director of geographic scholarship at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And you are tuned in to Angles on Bending Lines, our series of virtual talks on themes related to our current exhibition, Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. Before we start, I want to begin by calling attention to the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to indigenous peoples, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc nations, and descendants of the Massachusetts people. Copley Square, where I'm broadcasting from right now, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in all of North America. The maps that are in our collections bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, the maps don't simply document these histories, but they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all of our programs and interpretation, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real consequences on the present day. All of those themes are very present in our Bending Lines exhibition, where we take a close look at how maps shape what we know and what we believe about the world around us, and in turn, how these forms of geographic representation and knowledge can distort the truth, intentionally or unintentionally. Because our gallery in Copley Square is still closed, though I'm very pleased to actually be in the office today, so I am here, we've made Bending Lines an interactive online exhibition. You can visit it at the link below to dive into dozens of maps that were produced in order to make a point or to make an argument, from political propaganda to commercial advertising and social activism. The online exhibition was also designed with online audiences in mind, with interactive material where you can engage with the exhibition beyond just looking at the historic maps. Now, in Bending Lines, we're not just interested in historic materials and maps that are obviously trying to convince you of something. We also pay attention to the exploding proliferation of geospatial information in today's world. And we encourage our viewers to become more critically informed consumers of information that claims to be simply and unproblematically true. Whether questioning the racial categories that the census has used over time, or looking at how the very same data set can be used to draw conflicting and contradictory conclusions, Bending Lines turns a careful eye to the many human choices that are always layered into the kinds of information and representation that we collectively call data. It's this topic that we're exploring in a 4-part series of conversations this spring. This is the second in that series with Dr. Luis Alvarez León. Before I introduce Dr. León, I want to note that the Bending Lines exhibition is supported by a grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, and all of our work is made possible by the Boston Public Library. The Leventhal Center is an independent nonprofit that relies on contributions from viewers like you to support our free programs in areas ranging from geographic research and public talks to K-12 education and the preservation of our collections. If you enjoyed today's event, consider visiting leventhalmap.org/donate afterwards. Even a donation of just a few dollars can help support our mission of making programs that are free to all. Now I want to introduce today's speaker. Luis Alvarez León is an assistant professor of geography at Dartmouth College, where he is the director of the Critical Geospatial Lab. Dr. León is an expert in thinking about the ways that geographic data underpin the digital economy and the relationships between ownership and knowledge in the geographic information world. I'm really excited to have him on today. He and I actually overlapped for a short bit of time when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College. He's doing amazing work, building a really excellent research team of postdoctoral fellows and undergraduate researchers at Dartmouth, and we're really excited to have him talking with us today. Luis, how are you?
Hi, Garrett. Great, and very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and to the rest of the team at Leventhal Map and Education Center and Boston Public Library. It's really a treat, and I hope that I can visit there one day, but right now it's really great to be able to participate in a conversation like this that I think bridges a lot of different communities and sort of goes beyond what I usually do, which is kind of teach classes and kind of be in more kind of specifically academic environments. So I'm very excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you here, and also as a representative of one of the few geography departments in New England. So it's really great to have you. Luis, I wanted to start off by asking you, what are some of the key concerns that we should have in mind when we're thinking about the relationship of geographic information to the actual economy, to who owns and who pays for and who makes money, who profits off of maps and data? Perhaps you can introduce us to that topic.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Garrett. So I think that first, one important thing is to say is that the mapping economy is not a new thing. And the geospatial data, especially, I mean, given the context that you started with, it obviously has a very long history all across the world. And it's just that with the rise of the digital economy, it's transforming and it's acquiring new dimensions. And it's important to understand this for a number of reasons that I'll go into detail. So I'll give an overview of how I see the connection between maps, geospatial data, and the digital economy, and I think that will open up some questions that then we can discuss, especially as to why this matters in the broader scheme of, I would say, the rearticulation or the transformation of our economic landscape and the politics surrounding it. So that's kind of where I think this leaves us with. Now, so the key points just right off the bat are that I assert that the digital economy is profoundly influenced by geography. So it is not really separate. It's not abstracted from place or space or territory, but rather it's fully entangled with our geographic context. One reason for this is that maps and geospatial data, they allow for the valuation, for the marketization, and for the regulation of digital goods and services. And I'll go into how these things actually happen. But what this adds up to in my mind is that geospatial data has played now a fundamental role in really building what the digital economy looks like, the version that we have come to experience. And as such, if we acknowledge this role and we reframe what we have come to think of as the digital economy in geographic terms, I think we can reimagine it and actually reshape it more actively in ways that I think better suit what we might like to see in different contexts, as different communities, as different constituencies. So just a brief roadmap of where I'm going with this. First, I'm going to talk about the infrastructure of the digital economy, and then the three key steps that I see as sort of intervening in how geospatial data contribute to the digital economy are geolocation, valuation, and marketization. And that leaves us with different ways to reimagine the digital economy. So in terms of infrastructure, I think it's important to start by pointing out that when we talk about the internet, we're not talking about something that exists abstracted from, let's say, the physical environment or even the political organization of the world. And perhaps this is more visible to us now. But from the beginning, the internet was a project that was created to overcome particular spatial challenges. So this emerged out of the Cold War, and it was a communication system that was designed to, at least ARPANET in its initial configuration, which was Advanced Research Project Agency Network, was one of the precursors to the internet and was designed to circumvent the communication breakdown that could happen in the case of a nuclear attack in the midst of the Cold War. So this is already, we can see that it's enmeshed and entangled in territorial logics and geopolitics, and in the disbursement of funds and projects that built out a specific type of infrastructure. Now, this was not the only network that emerged in those years, but I think it's a sample of how I think from the beginning, the infrastructure of the internet followed this particular territorial logic that was tied to things like defense spending and institutional, the role of universities and research labs and so on. Now, of course, another aspect of this infrastructure is the sort of web of submarine cables that we have now that connect every continent and most countries in the world, and that are invisible to most users, but yet they have a very concrete physical reality, and they have to be maintained, and they have to be sometimes the capacity has to be expanded. There's a lot of capital, obviously, that goes into investing and expanding in this infrastructure. Even though it's hidden from view from most users. But this is part of the, let's say, the physical manifestation of the reality of the internet in terms of linking different places. Another aspect that we can talk about is, of course, data centers. So as more information is stored on the internet, or as we digitize and computerize more and more of our activities, and we have more and more devices that use digital information, well, the companies that are providing these services, they have built enormous sites, of which we have one here. The Facebook data center in Prineville, Oregon is one of the largest in the world, but we have many such centers distributed again, geographically in very specific locations corresponding to factors such as the availability of water for cooling purposes, low tax regimes, safety from natural disasters, geopolitical considerations such as having the data centers within or outside a particular country's boundaries for legal reasons. So once we start thinking about the internet geographically and its infrastructure, I think it comes to light the fact that it is not something that is sort of evenly spread, that is abstracted from the physical world or a political reality, but rather is fully entangled with all of these factors that also shape many of the other aspects of our lives. So the paradox here is that in the 1990s, particularly, but going all the way back to the 80s, there was a kind of a strand of techno-utopianism and a series of narratives that really fomented this idea that the internet was something separate, that the internet was aspatial, that it was, well, for a long time, it was indeed anonymous for most users. There was this very famous cartoon from The New Yorker that is actually the most reproduced cartoon from The New Yorker by Peter Steiner. And it's on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, which at the time was, of course, the joke landed because indeed most users experienced the internet anonymously. And so that, I think, fed the belief that the internet was indeed separate from all other aspects of our social reality. And I think gave, let's say, purchase to this notion of cyberspace as almost like a different plane of existence. So even though we might look at these conceptions as somewhat antiquated and quirky because they're from the 90s and there's all of this nostalgia going on, and now we just a lot of these images, I found them in like meme boards or kind of nostalgia trips trying to make light of this. The reality is that aspatial imaginaries are still going strong, and they've just been replaced by other ideas such as the cloud or even the Internet of Things. Even if we acknowledge that it's physical components and physical technologies that are connected to each other, all of which, of course, exist in our physical reality, and they have to be placed somewhere. I think that part of the crucial kind of sleight of hand here is that the way that the internet and internet services are envisioned is that how these things are connected together and how they are processed and where this takes place is sort of abstracted once more, in this case, through the narrative of the cloud, of something that is somehow floating above place, that is immaterial to a certain degree or is harder to pin down. And so that's a narrative that has supplanted those aspatial narratives from the 90s. But yet there's an interesting turn here, which is that the rise of geolocation technologies, on the other hand, kind of in parallel, makes our experience of the internet and of the digital economy quite embodied and quite tied to place and location. And this, we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A about how this happened, but essentially technological breakthroughs in the first in the late 1990s with unscrambling GPS location and making it more precise for civilian use, and then allowing for IP geolocation, which is essentially tying the IP address of a particular computer to the location where that computer is to a certain degree of precision, which has changed over time. That really opened the doors to connecting those information flows that were considered to be relatively abstracted and impersonal and pinning them down into physical location. What this allows, of course, is to provide context to information in geographic space. So now you can search for restaurants or post offices, etc. And a lot of the results that you will get in almost any search engine are going to be determined by proximity. And so this is really the shift that has happened that has enabled us to experience the internet and the digital economy in a much more geographic way. Not to say that it wasn't before, but now it's a lot more visible and in experiential terms more present to us. But also it has brought about new opportunities for mostly corporations to value that data and those information flows because it is tied to location and to context. And so that means that new commodities, new assets, new types of products can be created. And I think that the best example of this is targeted advertising, where platforms like Facebook and Google and many others can tailor the content to advertisers to maximize the exposure in a particular area, so that customers who either live in a particular place or are driving to a particular location or are even segmented by particular demographics, they can access the information that the advertisers want them to see. And so this is just one example, but we can think of many other examples in which the fact that we have information pinned to geographical location and with geographic content sort of allows for new economic relations and the creation of new types of goods and services. And this is, of course, heightened by the fact that we are experiencing, a lot of the time, we're experiencing the internet through our mobile phones. So these are devices that we carry with us and that have GPS capabilities within them, which in turn increases the value of this information. Now, the next step in building out this digital economy from a geospatial perspective is that once you have digital information pinned down to location and that you are sort of coming up with new ways to imbue it with economic value, then it has to circulate in specific markets. But those markets aren't just anywhere. Those markets are located in space and at different scales. So it could be the local market of Boston metropolitan area or New England. It could be the national market of the US, or it could be, in this case, like I'm showing right here, the single digital market of the European Union, which is one of the largest initiatives that the European Commission has been working on for years to actually, let's say, translate the single market that they have offline and to translate it for digital goods. So that is essentially to recreate many of the, let's say, conditions for trade that they have with many other physical goods for digital goods. But this, of course, is still territorialized. It's still defined by where people access information, by where the companies are located, who can be a part of this single market is very much tied to the boundaries of the European Union. And it in turn affects things like the legislation that is applied, the regulation, where server farms can be located, the types of privacy conditions that have to be met for a good or a service to be commercialized in Europe. So all of those are elements that are still territorially bound and yet profoundly shape how we can access the goods and services online, and therefore how those markets are built. Two components that we can look at how these markets are influenced by territory in this case is intellectual property regimes. So even if in theory information can circulate freely, which it can't, of course, and it depends on many other factors, such as the infrastructure that I pointed out before, we still have lots of other conditions that, in effect, constrain where and how people can access information and under what terms. So intellectual property is one of them. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, when you access your Netflix account, if you're in the United States, and if you travel somewhere else, even though you're the same user and the account is unchanged, the catalog will change. And that is one of the reasons is intellectual property regimes. Another reason could be the sort of distribution rights that have been purchased by Netflix for a certain catalog. Another aspect could be the local demand or the particular kind of let's say culturally specific or regionally specific offerings that are in that catalog. But those are some of the aspects that interact with how these markets are made. And then, of course, another aspect that brings us back to some degree to the infrastructure question is not so much an infrastructure in the sense of the cables on the server farms, but the informational infrastructure that underpins how goods and services, digital goods and services are provided. And so to come up with Google Maps or the sort of targeted advertising that I showed before, a lot of work had to be put in place for there to be accurate and reliable information concerning all kinds of, let's say we can call it layers, we can call it variables, we can call it aspects of reality that allow companies to derive value from this geospatial data. And this, a lot of that infrastructure has been created and collected by governments over a period of many years and has required lots of investment to produce things like orthoimagery, elevation data, transportation network data, databases of geographic names, the boundaries, land cover. So we now have, for example, a booming satellite industry that, of course, was kickstarted by government investment and government programs, even though a lot of it is now privatized. But you have, for example, in the case of the European market, a big part of creating this single digital market for the entirety of the European Union has rested on the interoperability and the exchange of geographic information from each of the countries that are members of the European Union, because that allows for the harmonization of data that then private parties, companies, or even citizens can access across boundaries and essentially access the same type of information or in the same type of format so that they can let's say, talk to each other. So those are some ways in which the digital economy is essentially not only shaped by geographical factors, but constructed through geographic data from the point at which it is information is pinned down to location, all the way to how it's valued, and then how these markets are actually constructed at various scales, let's say from the local to the macro regional. And so just to finish up here, the point of all of this for me is that our lives are already shaped by geography because we live in a particular location. We experience the world according to where we are, let's say the places where we visit, the countries of which we are citizens or to which we can travel, the services that we can access. So all of those geographic factors like place, space, territory, they influence our lives in every other aspect. But somehow, for a long time, the digital economy has, there's been this imaginary that has really taken hold that is separate from our everyday lives. And I think that there's some signs that those imaginaries are waning, especially since the past year we have lived so much of our lives online. It's clear how the sort of the digital world is completely enmeshed in our everyday experience and is not separate from the quote-unquote physical world. But nonetheless, if we reframe our understanding of the digital economy to reflect how it's influenced by geography, I think that this can help us answer pressing questions and come up with what I think are better answers to questions such as, under what conditions is this digital economy built? And how can we reimagine it? Or, for example, who are the winners? Who are the losers? Who is included? Who is excluded? Does it favor corporations? Does it favor certain countries? Who are the people or different constituencies that have a say in shaping how this digital economy is created? And what are the hidden costs and negative externalities of these markets? A lot of the times we can experience things as sort of seamless, but there's a lot of work, there's a lot of labor, there's a lot of let's say moving parts that we don't experience because they're abstracted from our view. But I think that the more that we can reframe the digital economy in the terms in which we live our daily lives and our ways of social and political organization, I think that we can have a digital economy that actually responds to that way in which we live our not only individual but also social life. So I'll leave it here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great, thanks, Luis. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed this overview, and I feel like we could probably go on for 3 or 6 or 12 hours on these topics.
Marathon session.
Yeah, exactly. I have a couple of questions for you, but I also want to say to our viewers, this is very much meant to be an interactive session. We welcome your own questions and points of discussion. If you're on Facebook or YouTube Live, you can drop into the chat or the comments thread below, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. I wanted to start, Luis, by asking you actually a question which echoes some of the points in your final slide, which is something that I find really fascinating about your work is the way you take something that feels to many people to be very new, right? The world of data, the world of cloud information, the world of the internet, which is in some ways characterized by this kind of radical break with the past, right? It's a world that seems to have no history and more importantly, no geography. And then you take what are in some ways old analytical frames of political and economic geography and apply them back to this supposedly new world, this supposedly frictionless, despatialized world of information. And so I wanted to think about that sort of fiction, right? The fiction that makes data, geographic information, the internet seem so discontinuous with the past, and ask you, who does profit from that? Who is perpetuating that sort of myth? Why is it that belief is so powerful that most people know nearly nothing about? Where is their data stored? What server farms are we accessing? This streaming platform, where are the electrons bouncing around? And then who governs it, right? Under what laws, what political systems create the markets in which it's embedded? So maybe you could say something about who is on the profiting and winning side of this myth, and then also who is at risk, who is potentially in danger, and who should be cautious about that myth.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Garrett. I think that you correctly identified the fact that these are old frameworks. I'm not trying to, in a sense, I really see a lot of value in rescuing that continuity, because precisely I think that there's a sort of a hype problem with any new cycle of technological innovation, and that it tries to, or the people who sort of are promoting it, in many ways it serves their purposes to erase the past. So, one, because newness is kind of tied intrinsically to something that is highly valued, and I think there are cultural factors for that, to sort of worship innovation for innovation's sake. But I think that there are other factors in this case that sort of, there's an ideology around technology that has sprung up, and people like Fred Turner have written very eloquently about like how there was this idea of making cyberspace a qualitatively different thing, where certain sort of communitarian ideals of many of the people who founded them, who were like people who grew up in communes, kind of sort of in the sort of aftermath of the 1960s and 70s in the Bay Area, they kind of found this space to translate into their ideas. I think that for a while in the 1980s and 90s, things like message boards and so on, and all these other places, they seem to correspond to this like aspatial sort of utopian quality, like almost like had this Platonic ideal of a place of a meeting of the minds. And I think that there were ideological and cultural factors for that, but ultimately, as the internet was increasingly commercialized, I think this has also served to obscure many of the costs of the internet. So even like, for example, the idea that it's does not use as many resources, for example. I think that now perhaps it has become more commonplace with the energy costs of Bitcoin and server farms and so other, that the digital economy is not necessarily a clean or a green economy. And that, yeah, I remember when Netflix first came up and a lot of people were just kind of giving their DVDs away, the sort of logic or the conversation was, well, it's better to just stream things online than to continuously buy things at the store, because then they're just going to end up in the landfill. And the reality is that I think that this aspatial narrative is very good for displacing and allowing us to ignore a lot of the costs, so that they're not directly tied to us as consumers, but they are distributed somewhere. And so you're not the one accumulating stuff, in this case DVDs in your house and then having to throw them out, but it's some distributed energy costs that perhaps you don't feel as bad about. And even though there isn't really that split between digital and physical, because as we have seen, one of the consequences of the pandemic is that people have been staying at home and buying stuff on Amazon all the time. And so you still end up with a lot of things at home, physical goods. So I guess to summarize that part is that I think that it has, even though there is an ideology and there are cultural factors, and maybe at some point the technology does seem to facilitate that sort of aspatial understanding of our social lived reality, the ones that really profit the most from it are the companies and the corporations who are providing these services, because the costs can be hidden, like, and the human costs as well, like who is involved in doing all of this labor under what conditions. Like, I don't know, I just know that I want my thing now, and I want it streamed, or I want it delivered in an hour, and like whatever happens after I click, that doesn't matter. And then those costs are shifted to specific populations who are vulnerable and who are working contingent labor, or doing content moderation, which is very harmful psychologically, and all of those things. But then also, I think that allows for sort of sweeping under the rug the conditions under which the data are produced and collected and they travel. And I think that part of sort of reclaiming the geography and using these old frameworks is because those conversations about every other aspect of things that affect our life take place in the political arenas that are defined by proximity and territory and politics. And so there's no reason to me that we should not be having those conversations about the digital economy in those arenas that belong to essentially the forms of political organization that we have built over time. So that is, your city, your state, your country, etc.
Luis, I want to ask a question about the way that a strange kind of almost what appears to be decommodified or free economy exists almost in parallel to some of these issues. For instance, I know you teach your students using open source software. We have tried more and more to develop programs around open data sets and, again, free software that's accessible to anyone. And of course, there's, that internet ideology that you speak of also has this powerful sort of information wants to be free, information should be free, right? Public agencies make free data sets available. Even private companies make extracts of their geospatial data available. So what would you say to a critic that says, wait a minute, it seems not to be big business at all. It's all about freedom of information and accessibility to quote unquote anyone. Anybody can pull this data, anybody can access it, anybody can work with the software. How can it be that a enormously both capitalized and privatized system is interoperating with that system of freely available, freely accessible data.
Yeah, I think that this is where also like old frameworks about mixed economies can help us understand what is going on with the digital economy, which is it's not either or. Just like there's also barter, and there's also exchange, and there's also like people helping each other out and mutual aid networks and all those things within a capitalist system. Like in the digital economy, of course, we have now many corporations that are essentially, let's say, some of the key players shaping the services and products that we access, but they don't have absolute control of the digital economy. And many of the things that people do online are still not necessarily mediated by direct exchange or even indirect exchange, monetary exchange. And so, projects like Wikipedia have been surprisingly resilient, and the open source software movement has continued to thrive, especially in certain corners of people who are kind of ideologically committed to maintaining them, because it takes a lot of work. So we need to acknowledge the fact that none of these things just sort of exist, but there's communities of people online, but they exist, in physical space, and many times they know each other. In academia, people who work with open source software, they many times contribute to either writing new code or maintaining new packages, or let's say spreading the word with their students and things like that. And so I don't think it's either or. There's also surprising intersections where things like OpenStreetMap, which is kind of like the equivalent of Wikipedia, but for maps, where people contribute to mapping for free, and this is a publicly accessible resource. There are many companies that use that resource, and that of course creates rifts and tensions within the user community. So we can see that there's a coexistence of, and there's tensions and sort of back and forth between the sort of the more commercial sides of the digital economy and those that operate under sort of different logics. And if perhaps I can characterize how they have how things have sort of shaken up in the past 2 decades, is that what the internet, I think, used to be more of a place where that was decommodified, that was not mediated by direct economic relations. And so there's definitely been a drastic expansion of the commercial sphere, and in many cases to the detriment of those other spheres that are unmediated by economic relations, which have their own politics, and they're shaped by many of the factors that many other communities are. So it's not, I don't want to necessarily characterize them as like utopian, but there's just different ways of organizing the creation and distribution of information. And a lot of it, like I said, there's increasing exchanges and interactions between those spheres, but I don't know exactly where this is going to end up, but it does seem that to me that the sort of corporate and commercial side has a lot more purchase and let's say influence.
Yeah. We've got some questions coming in from the audience, so let's try to get to some of them. Again, if you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, you can drop in a question or a topic at any time into the comments thread, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We have one from Nashe, and Nashe, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Nashe asks, how do you see the rise of the digital economy intersect with neo-colonial dynamics, particularly between the West and former colonial territories? The question goes on, how is anti-colonial, anti-imperial, sovereignty-based activism shifting within this digital economy?
Yeah, this is, thank you, Nashe. This is a fantastic question. And I think it speaks to how we should recover the fact that the internet, the digital economy, however we want to call this, is one iteration and is one latest version of an ongoing system of capitalism that mutates and changes and looks differently whenever new technologies come around, but that it is not divorced from these other historical processes such as colonialism, such as globalization, of course. And so as such, it is also plagued by the same asymmetries at different scales that have shaped those histories. And so those asymmetries can be geopolitical, such as between the former colonizing countries and their former colonies, but they can also be within the same country, so even within the same city. I mean, I was just reading a book, Uneven Innovation by Jennifer Clark, that makes the great case that the Smart Cities project, for example, is intrinsically a project of uneven development, because it exacerbates the division between the places that are quote unquote smartified and those that are not, so usually rural areas. But even within a city, those places that get, for example, the rollout of 5G are only certain specific, very concentrated locations within a city, and others are not. So I think that it is important to acknowledge the fact that there's already like an unevenness in our economic and social and political landscape, and digital economy comes to, let's say, graft onto that, and in many cases exacerbated through the distribution of those costs. So for example, like where a lot of this content moderation takes place. So if you look at a book like Ghost Work by Mary Gray and her co-author, so it takes place in well, many countries in the world, but there's like a substantial workforce in India where this is essentially hidden from consumers all over the world, and there are vast psychological impacts of looking at just really, really horrible content online. Also, we can think of the cycles of e-waste and where the e-waste ends up, and there are countries that are disproportionately recipient of e-waste, and those are usually countries in Africa, for example. I think Ghana is one of the countries that have received a lot of e-waste, but also China. And so I think that we definitely need to acknowledge that those asymmetries in many ways echo or continue the patterns of uneven development. Now, how to counter them? I think that it goes back to the core argument here, which is that by reframing the digital economy geographically, this is where, for example, the European Union has decided to take control. And this is not, I mean, the European Union is not as a whole, is not a disadvantaged region. But I think that they acknowledge that the way let's say mostly US-based information conglomerates were collecting personal information data and profiting from it was not according to the values that at least their citizens and their governments, let's say, promulgated. And so they drafted GDPR, the privacy regulation, and they came up with a way to organize their market in ways that sort of impose conditions on those corporations. And I think that was possible because it was a way of reorganizing that market according to the political logic of their territories. And I think that part of sort of pushing back against the costs of the digital economy is to organize territorially and to sort of really take on that problem as a form of political organization that is place-based. And that is, in some cases, is going to be at the national level. In other cases, it can be at the city level. Like some city can say they have, I think, certain constituencies, they have the ability to say, like, we do not want the rollout of this, subsidized, let's say, connectedness or Internet of Things or smart cities project, because even though it seems to promise lots of things, and in fact, it's actually going to privatize a lot of the profits, but kind of socialize a lot of the losses. And so that's one way, acknowledging the geographic nature and sort of reorganizing to push back along territorial and political lines. And then the other part is that, going back to the Wikipedia project and the more kind of communitarian or utopian aspects of online life, is that we do also have to acknowledge that the internet and the digital economy has provided spaces that have thrived to connect people that make common cause, and then in many cases use those very tools that are available, sometimes for free, sometimes through certain other means of exchange. Like many of the corporate services that we have are free in monetary terms, but we pay in our personal information, right? But even by repurposing those aspects and then shedding light on either the inequities that are perpetuated by the digital economy itself or by any other powerful actor. And so I think that and sort of acknowledging and supporting those other projects that are trying to reimagine not only the internet but the world, and doing so using internet tools is also a good way of changing and reimagining what the digital economy looks like, and making a connection with kind of not only local but I would say territorially organized forms of it's a political organization in different ways. I think those are two potential avenues.
Yeah, if I can just riff briefly off of a connection with the Bending Lines exhibition, we talk a little bit about how the ironic ways in which digital data reinscribes territorial lines. We give the example of the way that the India, Pakistan, China border gets kind of finessed by Google Maps, depending on whether you think Google thinks you're looking at it from India or China or Pakistan or somewhere else. And so the ability to fix a user into the governance geometry, right, of are you subject to Indian law, and therefore, the Indian government wants India to look the way they think it looks, or not. But then also the way that these kind of informal juridical systems, like even something like Wikipedia's content moderation policy, or who gets to make decisions if not a state actor, right? So the way that the internet is kind of constantly shifting back and forth between fixing individuals and users and corporations back into a state political system, and then creating a kind of cross-cutting system of governance is really challenging, and something that we should pay attention to, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main challenges. Like, what system of deliberation or organization sort of prevails when you have so many different competing, and you have, in some cases, some that are dominated by very powerful actors like corporations or states. And in other cases, even in those kind of communities, there are some voices that prevail over others. Like if you think about the gender split in OpenStreetMap, like that is, or in Wikipedia, like those are just facts that we have to contend with, and they're not free from the sort of power asymmetries that pervade through like every other sphere of life.
Yeah, here's a somewhat related question from Nicole. It says, not everybody has the resources to really access and work with this kind of data. There's a need of information and capital. I know you work with students from a variety of backgrounds as well as community organizations. That's something that we're trying to do as well, to think about how can we empower people who would not otherwise have the ability to work with geospatial information. But maybe you could say something about when information is either free or privatized, there still are barriers to entry, as you just noticed, or as you just noted, right? It doesn't cost anything to contribute to OpenStreetMap, and yet we still see striking divisions in the gender, nationality, ethnicity of the people who are doing so. And so what are some of the other ways beyond just financial power that we should think about leveling or equalizing the people's ability to work with and consume and create geographic information about themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a key challenge outside of the sort of technological capabilities and issues about the digital divide and so on. I think that the sort of informational burden and the sort of the fact that we're kind of overwhelmed and awash in a sea of data, it makes it difficult to decide and to intervene in meaningful ways. And I think that part of what I would like to rescue is kind of a building communities that are open and welcoming, and sort of counter what I think often happens in sort of technology-oriented circles, that the barriers to entry are very high, and so they become communities of specialists. And so I think that at the minimum, what we should aim for is to be like informed consumers of data, that we kind of try to have a sense of how and where we are interacting online, and what are the things that we want to support or not support. But that happens also socially. That happens by interacting with others who are kind of willing to take us along the journey and kind of help us understand and navigate this world. And making spaces and communities that are willing and able to do so. I think it's important, and so from an educational perspective, I think we can do that in the university or in the academic system. But this has to be broader than that, and so. So, for example, one of the projects that I have worked with that I really enjoy and I think is doing good work is Neighborhood Data for Social Change, which is a platform that we built when I was at the University of Southern California, and that is directly sort of oriented for local organizations, so that any kind of local organization doing work in the LA area can access it and look at it, and it's full of like tutorials and let's say work that contextualizes the databases that are made available. But then in addition to that, that's not enough, because just presenting people with resources is not enough, but it really makes an effort to build that community by inviting people over and having sort of ongoing events and seminars and training courses and so on, so that you can really bring people together in a way that allows them to either be more informed consumers of data, be aware of the sort of uses and abuses of data, and then also make those tools their own for whatever purposes they see fit. So I think this all goes back to that point about these are locally based projects. I mean, they can also be transnationally based projects, but I think there has to be a component of actually connecting with people to make common cause about something that transcends the sort of online interaction. So these are either like environmental justice organizations or neighborhood organizations or kind of immigration justice or whatever other kind of sports leagues, churches, all kinds of, these are the kind of, social organizations that have been with us for, centuries and that have not disappeared. In some cases, they have migrated online, but I think that they can. There's a good opportunity to connect the sort of online and offline components to increase the awareness and education, and at least develop, if not informed consumption of data, but ideally also a critically informed practice of how to use that data in ways that benefit them.
Yeah, and as I know, just despite the extraordinary ability to reach almost anyone across the globe through information technology, it turns out that many of the connections that we maintain online are the ones that are still physically proximate to us. And so I love the way, of course, that your work in Los Angeles is one of the kind of inspirations for work that we're also trying to build in Boston, in the New England region, as a hub for some of these similar efforts and similar approaches to community-based data curation, data access, and data knowledge. So we're just about at the top of the hour. I know we may not have gotten to quite every question, but I know Professor León would be happy to follow up again. He is at Dartmouth College, where he leads the Critical Geospatial Lab. You can visit at it's really wonderful website with a lot of resources and information about the publications that have been recently published, as well as in progress, at criticalgeospatial.org. Luis, I want to thank you for joining us. This was really great. And also a note to everybody that this video, as well as resources that we've discussed, will be online at our archived event page after the talk. Thanks, Luis.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, everyone over at Leventhal and everyone who participated and all of those who are watching. It was really a pleasure. And yeah, I hope to see you soon.
We're so glad to have had you here. I'll just note in closing that taking critical approaches like these to data justice is not just something that we're interested in with the exhibition and these talks. We're also developing programs and services designed to support data literacy and to help empower citizens with the tools they need to engage with data and map making. In the months to come, we'll be running a second iteration of our Making Sense of Maps and Data adult education course. You can also visit our website at any time, leventhalmap.org, where we have many resources and personalized assistance with geospatial information and how to access it and how to understand it. Please join us next week as we continue this series with Dr. Morgan Curry. We'll again be on at Wednesday at noon Eastern Time, again free on YouTube and Facebook Live. We invite comments and participation. If you enjoyed this event, we'd love to get your feedback on what you'd like to see us talk about next. Fill out our feedback form. The link will be in the chat. It's a short form to help us understand how you thought this went and to help shape our future programming. Again, you can always follow us on social media at BPL Maps or visit our website, leventhalmap.org, for more information. I'm Garrett Nelson, and hopefully I'll see many of you next week.